When Final Fantasy made the jump to 3D, Squaresoft began releasing the main games of the series on Sony hardware instead of Nintendo's. And for a very long time, if you only owned Nintendo consoles, well, Square Enix really didn't give you very much to play, outside of maybe a handful of spin-offs or an occasional port. But with the Nintendo Switch, things are definitely different. And if you're a Switch owner, you can play not only the first 10 games of the series, but also Final Fantasy XII and a whole bunch of other great side games and spin-offs, including Crisis Core, which is a new personal favorite of mine. Honestly, the Switch has become a pretty good system to play Final Fantasy games on, but Square Enix and the Nintendo systems have not always had a relationship like this. So what changed? And what exactly went down between Nintendo and Square that led to the Final Fantasy series becoming a Sony exclusive, with new entries of the series even to this day typically releasing as PlayStation exclusives? Let's start at the beginning. Final Fantasy I released on the Nintendo Entertainment System in Japan in December 1987, and then it made its way to the US in 1990. The game quickly became a success for the company, and Squaresoft followed it with 2 more games on the Nintendo, and then 3 more games on the Super Nintendo. The series had found its place as somewhat of a competitor to Enix's role-playing game, Dragon Quest, which was localized in the West as Dragon Warrior until the 8th game in the series, which released the first 4 games on the original Nintendo Entertainment System, and it actually didn't have any English games for the Super Nintendo. And on to that numbering thing, so we've got Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3 in the United States, which are really Final Fantasy 1, 4, and 6 in that respective order. Really awful, really confusing stuff, and it's only made worse by the next numbered entry in the United States being 7. So when Squaresoft began development on their 7th entry in the series, it was an obvious choice for the game to come out on the Nintendo 64, and the company began to work on tech demos utilizing the Nintendo 64's hardware. However, the teams would quickly run into limitations as the cartridge-based Nintendo 64 games could only hold 64 megabytes of data, and that's 10 times less than that of a typical PlayStation 1 disc. With the original Final Fantasy VII coming in at 1.3 gigabytes spread over 3 discs, you can see the glaring issues with the Nintendo 64 cartridges. In a Polygon article from 2017, Hironobu Sakaguchi, the producer and executive vice president of Square, states on the subject, PlayStation games being on CD was the biggest factor. If you wanted to make a 3D action game on a Nintendo 64 cartridge with that limited space, you could do it, but I wanted to create a 3D role-playing game. It was very clear in my head what I wanted to make, but that would have been difficult on Nintendo's hardware. The biggest problem was, of course, memory. Based on our calculations, there was no way it could fit all on a ROM cartridge. So our main reason for choosing the PlayStation was really just because it was the only console which would allow us to use the CD-ROM media. And Shinichiro Kajitani, vice president of Square USA at the time, states on the subject that at that time, Square was really close to Nintendo. We were basically like a second party for them. So when their new system was in development, we gave them lots of advice, like, you're going to need a CD-ROM for it. You don't have enough bandwidth to do what we're trying to do, and with what you have now, we're not going to be able to make an RPG. We gave them lots of advice, but Nintendo's president basically refused to listen to any of it. And that's when Sakaguchi-san and the management team at Square decided, okay, we're really going to go with Sony now. And I would say they made the right call with that. Final Fantasy VII was a huge success, and to this day remains one of the best-selling entries in the series, selling over 10 million copies on just the PlayStation 1, and becoming the second highest-selling PlayStation 1 game of all time. A game on this scale just would have never been possible with the Nintendo 64's hardware, without taking massive hits to their vision. The way that the game weaved pre-rendered backgrounds and full-motion video into its storytelling gave the game a much more cinematic feel that you just couldn't achieve on the Nintendo 64, and it became somewhat of a staple of the series, at least during the PlayStation 1 era. I have a hard time imagining what a Final Fantasy VII on the Nintendo 64 would have ended up looking like. Like, the cutbacks would have been drastic, and I think it's clear that Squaresoft made the right choice. And as for beating their competition, while Dragon Quest VII and Final Fantasy VII sold pretty close in Japan, Dragon Quest VII only moved around 200,000 copies overseas, whereas Final Fantasy VII became a worldwide hit. However, making that move from Nintendo to Sony undeniably led to some bad blood between Squaresoft and Nintendo. Shinichiro Kajitani from the Polygon article states, "When we made the decision to go with Sony, for about 10 years we basically weren't allowed into Nintendo's offices. From a consumer's point of view, it was good to have two companies competing with each other because prices wouldn't rise and it would be better for them. But from a business perspective, our main interest was making sure that Sony won and Nintendo lost, basically because that would be better for us." While we are a long way removed from these times, I personally think it's interesting to look back on. The Nintendo 64 received zero support from Squaresoft whatsoever, and the GameCube and Wii basically got a few Crystal Chronicle games, and I think that's really about it. But the Crystal Chronicles series was never really met with like super positive reception. I've personally not played too much of those games, and I think it's worth mentioning around this time that Squaresoft and Enix merged into one mega RPG company in an attempt to strengthen both companies' varying weaknesses. On a quick side note, I want to take a minute to mention that while the Final Fantasy series shifted away from Nintendo pretty hard during this era, there is a hidden gem from the creator of Final Fantasy, that being Hironobu Sakaguchi, and it's on the Nintendo Wii. You see, he actually left Squaresoft in 2001, at least I think he left before the merger, and that really kind of made Final Fantasy IX the last game that he fully worked on. And when he left the company, he went on to form Mistwalker Studios, which made a couple of my favorite, I don't know what you want to call them, maybe hidden gem kind of RPGs, those being Lost Odyssey and The Last Story. If you're a fan of Final Fantasy, particularly from the PlayStation era, and you haven't really checked these out, check these out, because these games are classics. If you're going to pick just one, I would have to give a slight edge to Lost Odyssey, but I think they're both pretty interesting to take a look at. And on a side note within my side note, I want to point out that I think it's kind of lame that as an Android user, I can't play Mistwalker's most recent game, Fantasian, because it's stuck on the Apple Arcade. Whatever that is, I'm not an iPhone user, so I don't know. If any of you guys are iPhone users and have checked out Fantasian, let me know what you guys think of that in the comments section, because I'm kind of interested in this one, especially as Sakaguchi is quoted as saying, "I think it is certainly possible that this could be my last project." And that was kind of in the back of my mind as we were developing it. But then again, he also kind of thought that Final Fantasy might be his last project. And I think he thought that The Last Story might be his last project as well. I mean, it kind of seems like my dude has been trying to get out of the business for basically the entire time he's been in the business. It's kind of weird. But seriously, if this is the last game he makes, I definitely am going to have to check that out. And it seems to have reviewed pretty well. Anyway, after the Wii, Nintendo released the Wii U, which unsurprisingly received very little support from most third parties. But during these years, Nintendo's handheld consoles started to perform really well. The DS, the 3DS, and even the Game Boy Advance were receiving quite a lot of attention from Square Enix, whether that be in the form of ports or even exclusives. The handhelds are home to some really great RPGs, such as Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. On the DS and the 3DS, there's those awesome Dragon Quest ports, and they've even started some new series like Bravely Default. And with the Nintendo Switch bridging the gap between handheld and console, you can see that Square Enix has really gone fully on board with supporting the system. There are a ton of amazing RPGs on it. However, it's undeniable that if you want to play the newest Final Fantasy games, well, the Switch simply can't run them. Similar to the Nintendo 64, it would just never work. So you're probably going to want to get yourself a PlayStation 5. Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth most likely won't be making their way to the PC for quite a while yet, and Xbox versions seem unlikely at best. But for me, I love my Switch. You can't beat gaming while you're lounging around on the couch or just laying in bed. It's a really great system, and it's great to see Nintendo get this kind of support from Square Enix. And I really hope we can continue to see this from whatever Nintendo's next console will be. Anyway, thanks for watching. That's it for this one. If you liked this video, don't forget to like the video, and hey, consider subscribing to the channel for more Final Fantasy stuff. And yeah, that's it. See ya.